Hi everyone, my name's Matt Beats, and I am on the research faculty at the University of California, Irvine in the Department of Informatics, and I'm also part of the Health Data Exploration Network. The HDE project is hosting a series of webinars on topics of interest to people who are interested in using new forms of data for research. And today we have an excellent webinar plan to discuss Crisis Text Line, and joining me today is Bob Philbin, who's the Chief Data Scientist at Crisis Text Line, and Nitya Kanuri, who's the Open Data Collaboration Manager there. So welcome, Bob and Nitya.
Thank you.
I guess just to get started, can you tell us a little bit about Crisis Text Line and what it is you do?
Sure, I'll take the start on what is Crisis Text Line. So Crisis Text Line is a 24/7 service for people in crisis by text. We started in August of 2013, and so we've been active for a little over 3 years. And in that time, we've exchanged over 26 million messages with people in crisis. These crises cover the wide range of anything that somebody experiences. So depression, thoughts of suicide, self-harm, anxiety, coming out as gay or bullying, etc. And it's 24/7. It's national, and it's largely organic in terms of growth. We had a launch in a couple markets, Chicago and El Paso, and put out marketing there. From that point, it's really been organic growth. So the types of issues that we see, the types of people reaching out, they are finding our service imminently useful, and therefore sharing that with other people in crisis who, in many cases, have never reached out to a crisis service before.
Great. It sounds like it's a really amazing service that you provide. I guess, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the volume of calls that you get?
Yeah, so we think in terms of conversations, like very similar to a call. We have had at this point over 650,000 conversations, and that equates to that 26 million messages. So every conversation is around 40 to 50 messages exchanged. So these are very rich conversations by text message. They can take anywhere, on average, between 45 to 60 minutes. Part of the reason is we're seeing a message about every minute. Part of the reason for that delay sometimes in messages is people are texting in the middle of their daily life. People texting from their offices, from school. About 75% of our texters are under the age of 25. So we have people texting from biology class or in the lunchroom at school. And that is to say they're texting in their moment of crisis. So the types of conversation, the language we see being used is very much of the moment. People mention the word today 6 times more often than any other time-based word. These are crises as they're unfolding in the moment. So the language that texters are using is very interesting. You see, this is their hot moment. This is the moment of greatest need. And so how are they talking about crisis in the moment?
Great. And I'm curious about how you manage that process on the back end. What is the process inside your organization for handling all of these conversations?
So in terms of storing the data or actually responding in real time to the data?
Well, I'm just sort of getting a sense of, who's answering them, who do you have doing that, what does the process look like on your end?
Yeah, sure, I'll take that one. So everything, all the inbound texts are answered by our volunteer base, which at the moment is about 2,400 strong and growing. Volunteers just need to be 18 years or older and have a valid U.S. social, so we can do background checks. And then they have to go through a 36-hour online training. Once they pass that, they sign up for, and they commit to 4 hours, 1 4-hour shift per week for a year. So we, on our end, try and match inbound texts and crisis counselor capacity. So some hours of the day have more volume, and we try and encourage more people to sign up for those shifts.
And are people actually at your organization, or are they doing this from home? Or
we have very few people in our office. The relative size of our organization, we have maybe 20 or so staff in office. We have another 25 to 30 that are remote around the country. We have a couple like satellite locations where people congregate, but the volunteers are everywhere. They're all around the U.S. They're volunteering from home. We have people who are volunteering who are active military, who are deaf and hard of hearing, who are visually impaired. So a lot of groups, not only that are volunteering from where they live, but also groups that in many cases couldn't volunteer anywhere else. That's one of my favorite parts of this organization is we're really opening the door, both for a very intense and valuable training around how to actively listen, how to collaboratively problem solve these universal life skills that you could use with anyone. And we've talked to a lot of counselors, and actually Nivea is a counselor, who use this in their daily lives, to talk to their friends and family. But that not only do we give that training, but it opens the door for volunteers who just wouldn't have the chance to volunteer anywhere else.
It's really amazing that and to have sort of that depth of volunteer expertise as well as you're working with them. And I guess I'm curious about this process of giving, of sort of having these conversations. Thinking about this as the sort of traditional phone lines and other things. How is doing this in a text message different from doing it, say, over a phone or even face to face?
So I actually was a volunteer on a phone line for a couple of years and have been a volunteer here. So I'll speak from that perspective. I think one of the primary differences of being a crisis counselor via text is that you have a little bit more time to process what you've seen and give a really, really strong response. And in that time, you have the support of a supervisor who is always on the web-based platform through which you respond to these texts in case you see something challenging and want to touch base with your supervisor or the broader crisis counselor community that is online at the same time. In contrast, on a phone, for better or for worse, you're responding real time. You have tools like this to convey empathy and support and concern. You have tone. So I think in text, you have to be a lot more thoughtful with your language, but you also have that additional time to be thoughtful and support.
You also don't get some of the distractions that you might get by phone, like lack of a quality connection if you're getting noise in the background, or if somebody is crying or something like that and you garble the words. Those distractions are left aside, so you just get the raw content. And so some ways that can actually simplify the process or make the crisis clear and responding to it more direct.
It's really interesting, sort of thinking about sort of what this interaction is like. Do you think that you're reaching different people through text than you might reach through phone?
I will also say the flip side is one of the other biggest differences is what this medium and type of exchange invites in terms of comfort on the side of the person reaching out for help. So as Bob mentioned, 75% of our population is below the age of 25. And because of the medium, it invites people who might not feel comfortable talking on the phone. It also invites people who might not have the ability in that moment to call someone on the phone. So we actually see an increase in volume around school time, like at lunchtime every day. I've actually taken conversations from kids who've been next to their girlfriends on a bus on a school field trip, talking about some of the stress that existed there. So definitely a different population demographic as well as issue types that come through.
We see that around 2/3 of our texters are mentioning something that they've never told anyone else. So not their friends, not their family. These are people who are mentioning things for the very first time. So in that sense, it seems like we're really reaching a population that hasn't had this kind of support before.
Wow, it's the project as a whole is just so fascinating to me, and it's such a great service, and I think an innovative service the way that it's working. But we're here to talk about sort of the data aspect of it, so I wanted to pivot a bit to that. And so, can you tell me a little bit about the data that you collect as part of this?
So we have these 26 million messages, 650,000 conversations since we launched in August of 2013, and the pace continues to increase. We're processing around 1.5 million messages per month at this point. We are looking at all the associated data around these conversations. So these conversations are just naturally collecting in our system now. So we have the metadata around them, like what time of day they occur, what are the issues that came up in the conversation. So we have the counselors tagging some of this information, like the issues that came up. And then we have the message content. And I think one thing that's really unique about this data set is that message content. Like one of the other biggest data sets out there on mental health for young people is the CDC does the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. But that happens once a year. So you're asking people to think back over the course of the year and think about the crises they experienced. And then, so there are lots of reporting biases embedded in that survey. What's different about ours is people are talking about a crisis as it's unfolding in the moment. So not only do you get a more accurate perspective of what crisis occurred for that texter, you also get all the associated issues. So if somebody's feeling suicidal, you get what led to that feeling, or the ramifications of that feeling, and how the words people actually used around it. So we see, for example, some of our texters use the phrase KMS, which I had no idea what that meant. Turns out that means kill myself. So there's language here. There's like an understanding of how people are talking about these feelings that you wouldn't get from any survey data. And so I think that message content side is very, very unique. The other side that's very unique is the fact that we're collecting this data every day. So we have the volume, the velocity, and variety of data that's coming out of this just naturally occurring conversations that can give us context like, how does crisis differ on the holidays? So what's different about the week around Thanksgiving versus the week before, or what's different in the school year versus the summer? And so those nuances about how crises can vary over time by location is transparent in our data that would be missed otherwise.
It's really interesting to think about that, and I'm thinking about sort of, in order to make those kind of the kinds of comparisons that you're talking about, thinking about, you have the content of the conversation, but you're also collecting a lot of metadata about sort of what that conversation, where it was, and when it was, and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about what else what that metadata entails? What else do we know about the people or the conversations that you've had?
So demographics is one thing. So we have the time, we have location, we have a proxy for location based on the texter's phone number and the location presented from that phone number. There's actually still people I think would naturally be skeptical of that, saying like, well, I moved, I'm no longer in the place where my phone number area code represents. But for young people, actually what we see is a very high match between a texter's area code and their actual location. Most young people haven't moved. They're going to college locally at a state school or community college. And so in some previous analysis that I ran, we were seeing about a 94% match between area code and actual location. So location data is pretty solid to that level of specificity. We have all the timestamps around the conversations, and they're really fascinating patterns that you can see. If you live in the Northeast, we have some of this data available publicly. And one that always pops out to me is if you live in the Northeast, it's a very anxious place. Basically, if you look at the percentage of conversations about anxiety per state, the states in the Northeast are all at the top. We have some of this data available at crisistrends.org, right? So you can see this, except for Vermont. Vermont is doing really well. People are not anxious there. But the rest of the states in the Northeast and Utah are high up there. So these types of patterns, I think, like the location, the time-based patterns are revealing insights about how anxiety or suicidal ideation occur that we couldn't otherwise see. The other thing we have is demographics. So 75% of our texters are under the age of 25. We also know things like the percent that are identified as American India is around 5%. The national population, it's 1.7%. So for one of the highest risk, if not the highest risk population in terms of actually following through on suicide or completing suicide, they are texting our service at a rate 3 times the percentage of the population that they represent. We also know that the lowest 10% of zip codes by income represent 19% of our texters. So we're reaching, it appears, like a more vulnerable population, a population that has less access to resources, but also tends to experience higher rates of crisis.
So for that demographic information, how do you get that? Is that something that comes up in the context of the conversations, or do you also survey the people who've texted in? How do you get like age and other demographic variables?
So at the end of each conversation, we ask a question to the texter. Did you find this conversation helpful? And they can answer yes or no. And if they answer, we follow up with a longer survey in which we ask them to volunteer information about their gender, their age, whether this service is something they've used before, and their overall experience.
It's really, yeah. And what percentage of people would you say, or how frequently do you get people filling out that extra survey?
We have the basic survey, and the response rate there is around 45% for that yes question. So that's why we made it that binary, one question. We wanted a really high response rate. And then the follow-through to the extended survey, this is something we just launched relatively recently. The response rate's around 10% of all of our texters right now, but we're testing ways to kind of boost that. We may end up combining the surveys. That just speaks to the fact that we're always iterating and improving on our data collection. I think what we do see and what we have the opportunity to do, though, is actually training based on those 10% of conversations or based on the 45% of conversations. One thing we constantly do internally and are looking to do projects with researchers on is training out algorithms based on the data. So if you have markings for 10% of the conversations, what can that tell you about the other 90%? So if we know that, for example, the suicidal risk is something we look at of a certain percentage of conversations, can we figure out the suicidal risk of other conversations in our data set? And then one step further, actually turn that into a product to identify the suicidal risk of texters who are just coming into our system. So the really nice thing about our data set, or one of the things I'm really excited about, is we own the data, but then we actually own the implementation too. So we can turn the data and insights from that into products that better serve future people in crisis coming into our system.
I think this is one of the things that I find most fascinating about the work that you guys are doing, is that it's not just providing a service, but it seems you've got a real commitment to sort of learning from what you're doing and turning that around quickly, both for practice and for further research. And so I guess talking about that a little bit, and with the data collection that you do, I know that you've got sort of programs in place to open up your data and to share it with researchers. And so can you tell us a little bit about sort of how those programs work and what's available?
Yeah. So about a year ago, we got about $1 million from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, largely to support opening up this data. Just as much as we love to use it to improve the service, I think there's a lot that can be learned from it to improve the broader crisis intervention space. So the 3 ways in which we share this data is 1 on crisis trends, which you just shared, so in aggregate to the public, in aggregate anonymized to the public. 2 would be with our keyword partners. So keyword partners are organizations or cities or departments that we partner with to give them specific data back on their population. So NEDA, the National Eating Disorder Association, is one organization that markets our number 741-741 to their population. They tell them to text NEDA to 741-741, and then we gather all that data and share it back to them so that they can learn about who is texting in, what are the other issues that are occurring in their population, and better learn when they're reaching out for services, and filter that back into things like policy change. So maybe we're getting a lot of requests for eating disorders at a time when local services aren't available. How can that stimulate change? And the third vehicle is our Enclave data partnerships, in which we enable academic researchers with non-commercial interests to submit applications to ask questions of our data. Those would be reviewed by our internal ethics committee and then counter-reviewed by their institution review. And if it clears, then we share a cut of our data to support their research question. And those are things like, does weather vary with mental health? At a conversation level, is there certain language used on the side of a crisis counselor that motivates or that de-escalates risk in the side of a texter?
There are a lot of fascinating trends up on crisistrends.org to explore there. Like one that stands out to me is if you look at substance abuse by time of day, that one's very surprising to me, and I think what crisistrends.org can do is give people a sense of the data and a sense of what we're collecting. We're actually rolling out a new version of that before the end of the year that will give more nuance by location, so give more state-specific data around the crises occurring, and then more nuance in the types of words that are being used by texters. So that will so you can see, and this is always a question I ask, like bring up some of these when I present around our data. It's great to ask an audience beforehand, what do they think the pattern is going to be? Often the findings are very counterintuitive to what people expect. People expect a kind of a late evening night spike in when you see substance abuse, but it turns out 7 a.m. is the peak. Or if you look at suicidal ideation by state, Montana's at the top. The fascinating thing there is that that's the same data you would see in the CDC reports. But the difference, again, is that our data is coming in daily. We can see these nuances break down over time. Like when is really the peak in when Montana is experiencing suicidal ideation, and does that have any variance by location or time? So those types of nuances allow for that type of research, like how does crisis vary with the weather? Or the University of Utah is doing, looking at altitude and suicidal ideation. So there's some research to support that brain chemistry changes with altitude and increases your risk of things like depression and suicidal ideation. So they want another data set to bring into the mix to see if our data supports that.
Wow, it's sort of amazing. I keep thinking about sort of the richness of this data set and the number of different things that we could bring to bear on it, given what you have and the different kind of comparisons. And so I think, again, encouraging people to go to it's crisistrends.org is the URL. Is that correct? And just seeing some of the stuff you've put there is, again, like you said, there's stuff you wouldn't expect that is kind of surprising, like the substance abuse time of day and some of the others. But it gives a sense of how rich this data is, even when presented sort of at the aggregate level like this. And I know you mentioned as well the Enclave data, this idea of having sort of more close partnerships with researchers who can get access to more of the raw data. Can you say a little bit more about what that process entails if a researcher wanted to do that?
Yeah, so also on our website, you'll see a link called Open Data Collaborations, which shares all the details about it. But generally, a researcher would identify a professor, or if they're not already one, in a university, define their question. Online, we provide a list of the data and the different variables that we gather, and use that to customize and specify what it is you'd like to ask. You'd outline that. You'd outline your data security plan. Even if we're sharing de-identified data, it's really important to us internally that we protect the privacy of our data and our texters, and data security is a big part of that. And then you'd submit your application on a quarterly system. In the next 2 months, it would be reviewed internally by our ethics committee. And then we select about 3 to 5 teams per quarter. After hearing back about acceptance, you would ensure you have IRB, Institutional Review Board clearance from your institution, make sure your data plan and data protection plan is in place, and then we would share data via a secure server on Amazon Web Services. The researchers would be allowed to VPN into that server, so they still get to access it, still get to run analyses on it, but security is protected from our end.
Yeah, so we're basing a lot of this on the University of Michigan. They have a ICPSR, Inter-University Consortium for Social and Political Research, and that's one of the biggest consortiums out there that allows this kind of remote access into sensitive data. And so a lot of our strategies on how we've opened up this data rely on the precedent that they've set. And so we have this remote enclave access system where you're basically remoting in. The data isn't that there's no data file sent. It's living on a server on Amazon Web Services. And so you're remoting into a desktop basically and doing your work within that system.
Okay. That's it. And I know ICPSR, and I know it's a great model for doing research. And so building on that seems like a good plan. Can you tell me a little bit about, one of the things that I've been thinking about is this is pretty sensitive data. And you mentioned that already, for that. I guess, tell me a little bit about sort of what steps you go through to kind of protect to protect the people who've used your service as you share the data.
Yeah, I think one of the things that was most it took over 2 years, I'll say, from the time when we had the idea that we were going to share the data, we had that from the very beginning, but even when we started working on it, it took 2 years to get to the point where we were actually ready to share. It's such a long process to make sure that the security and the privacy is in place, and now Nithya is here working full-time just really to oversee that process and making sure that we have the privacy set up. I think one of the most critical things that we did was the creation of this ethics committee. So these are experts in ethics from across the IRB universe and others, ethicists at universities. So people like Bob Levine, who's the head of the IRB at Yale, and then other folks who have sat on ethics committees for IRBs at Harvard Medical, and so just making sure that we had our own internal process. Like one of the things that really surprised me actually was some of the time when we go through the IRB process with a research team at their own university, the university gives them an exemption. It's not an active subjects test. There aren't any subjects. There's no experiment. The data is historical, so it gets an exemption. And yet we're dealing with texters' personal information, their health information, sensitive stuff. So what we realized is we needed our own ethics review process to really handle, I think, what we're seeing is this new world of big data, big historical data that can have a lot of privacy and sensitivity to it, but doesn't fall within your traditional IRB protocol as something that's sensitive. And so what we've ended up with is several checks along the way, basically, and then following the best practices in the space that we saw at University of Michigan, at the CDC, and NIH. Those are the three big entities that are sharing this type of data. And so we've really turned to those three and followed their best practices in terms of making sure we're maintaining privacy and security of the data.
And as you do that, I'm assuming, or maybe you can tell me a little bit about, do you do any kind of data processing as well before you share it? Do you do anything to de-identify the data or remove things that might eventually lead back to one of your users?
Yeah, we definitely only share de-identified data. So the names are masked. The phone numbers, we only share the first 6 digits, so they can still deduce the county level, but they don't actually have the identifying info. So yeah, for the most part, it is de-identified before we share it. The sensitive part comes in when you share message level data with researchers. A lot of whom want that info, since a lot of that richness is there. And so even then, we go through a process of scrubbing for all potentially identifiable health info by identifying proper names and scrubbing those, identifying any shared email addresses in case someone might have texted that in, by being mindful of locations they might share that are smaller than a state. So we do our due diligence to make sure we share all de-identified info, but counter to that, we also have policies in place with the research teams. Again, this is why it's a very heavy-handed vetting process, such that if they did identify something, there's a procedure they have to follow to report that back. And anything that gets shared publicly should be run by crisis text line first. So a couple of different mechanisms in place to protect texter privacy.
I think one of the challenges is also one of our biggest opportunities is that we're probably the first not-for-profits sharing this level and scale of sensitive data, and so the opportunity is, one, we're running these scrubbing algorithms over the data, and that's pretty interesting in terms of that process of how do you actually de-identify 26 million messages. So there's some algorithmic work there that's pretty exciting. And then there's also the opportunity of really setting the precedent for how other not-for-profits can expand their impact by sharing data. A lot of not-for-profits are sitting on huge data sets related to their issues. Donors Choose is one that comes to mind that's already going through a strong data sharing process, and they're sharing data around needs in classrooms. But what we're hoping to do as a part of that small group of organizations that are sharing data is really set a precedent. We've had a number of groups reach out to us, like U.S. Digital Service, fellow at Harvard, a team at Stanford, that are curious about our data sharing process in itself and making that a subject of research. And if you can find insights into how we're doing this that other not-for-profits could replicate. I think that's going to be one of the side effects of this process that's going to be potentially really useful and is worth research, is how do you do this? If all not-for-profits that are collecting big data sets could share them out, one, that would be amazing for impact. Two, it would provide a lot more juicy research for the academic community. And if it's done well with these measures in place, then we're not risking privacy at all.
Right, and I think that's one of the things that I find really interesting. I mentioned, my background is in informatics and in information science, and I know that, I'm thinking about sort of your data sets, not just in terms of their health implications, but also in general for the implications for how to share data and do this. It feels like you guys have set up some really interesting processes to go through with this, and so that there are a lot of opportunities there that extend beyond the health impacts of the data you have as well.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting processes, like creating this enclave system where we're not actually transmitting data. So the challenge with transmitting data is then you're kind of sharing responsibility for the protection. So not only do you have to have good protection on privacy and security, but the receiving partner takes on some of that responsibility as well, which is both a challenge in the sense that you don't know if the security and privacy is the same, but you're also saying like, hey, take on this like liability, which is not necessarily something that an academic group or researcher wants to do, is sharing that liability. And so I think one of our big things was how can we do this and make it there's no compromise, there's no like two sets of privacy and security that we have to worry about. We know everything. We're not putting any responsibility on the researchers' end to have that security and privacy in place. So how can we just like simplify this process as much as possible do the work up front, and make it really easy for when the researchers do get access to the data, actually just purely working with the data.
Well, and it sounds like that also, in a lot of ways, simplifies the infrastructure that the researchers need to have to work with your data as well. That it's not necessarily for them to build up their own secure, super secure enclave system themselves, because they can use what you guys are providing.
Yes, it makes it a lot easier, I think, for the researchers rather than having to add security measures or infrastructure to their own system. They can just rely on ours.
Yeah.
And I think we wanted to open up the ability to access this data to teams across a range of disciplines. So we have our computer science teams who are really excited about machine learning algorithms and the richness and bigness of this data and what they can do with it. And they might be set up to do some of that, but we also have teams from, Appalachian State, geology and planning. We have social science groups, teams from Colorado Hospital. So to enable them to do this kind of research where they're not going to have the infrastructure, I think the additional legwork on our end has made that a little bit more possible. Yeah,
that's really, it's interesting the way that providing that infrastructure actually opens up access even further. So if a researcher was going to go through this process of getting access to the data, about how long does it typically take to go through that application process?
Yeah, so our deadlines are every quarter. So the application should take, if you have your research question outlined and defined, it should take maybe an hour or two to fill out. We don't require they have institutional review prior. We request they get that following acceptance. We do have a lot of applicants coming in, and we don't want to make it too difficult. So once they get that submitted, within 2 months' time, we'll let them know if they've been accepted, and then we target sharing data with them within a month.
And what we're really looking for in those applications is we kind of 4 pillars. We have the security, the privacy, the ethics, and then the value back to our user population. And so we're looking for teams that can speak well to each one of those 4 components, that the data and privacy is going to be protected, that there's ethics in terms of what the potential ramifications of doing this analysis are, that it will only lead towards good things for the users, and then is there concrete value in the question that's going to be brought back to our users specifically, or generally. We're not that strict. It's really for people in crisis in general. Is this going to be useful and help people in crisis around the country?
Can you give me an example of that kind of feedback loop that you're talking about, where that value comes back? Do you have an example where that's happened, or that you're thinking about?
Yeah, so I can speak to one that we've worked on internally, and I think speaks to the potential in the data and what researchers could do with this. So one project that we've worked on internally is a texture triage tool. So we have most traditional crisis lines act on handling volume in terms of the order in which it comes in. So there's a queue when there tends to be a spike in volume, which can happen periodically. We saw a big one actually around the election. There was a lot of anxiety and concern, and so we actually saw 8 times our volume on the night post-election coming through, and a lot of other crisis lines did as well. Traditional crisis lines handle that volume with a queue and order and answer in the order in which it came in. We add a second layer, which is like hospital. You triage based on severity, and so the person with the gunshot wound gets helped before the person with the broken leg. Same with us. Somebody who's suicidal, somebody who's self-harming, they get prioritized above somebody who's struggling with a relationship issue. So our original version of that triage tool was a list of 50 words that we just came up with based on what we know was likely to be about suicide. So suicide, die, kill, things like that. But we really just came up with that list of words anecdotally based on conversations that we had seen. And so anything in which we saw one of those words while the texter was waiting in the queue, we would move to the top of the queue. And so we ask a question, an automated question, before a texter gets connected with a counselor, saying, what brings you here today? And so the responses to that is what we're coding for suicidal risk. First version worked pretty well. It was accurate at identifying high-risk conversations. but we knew we could do better. So we had a machine learning intern last summer who worked on this project, and he'll be coming on full time soon. Really smart guy, but so he built this algorithm that automatically identified 10,000 different phrases and words with varying degrees of association with suicidal risk. And so some of them were really surprising to me. Like one term had 16 times the likelihood of occurring in a conversation that ended up being an act of rescue. So that's our highest level of risk. It's where we send out emergency services to intervene in an active suicide attempt. So 16 times the likelihood of occurring in an act of rescue, and that was common over-the-counter household drug, ibuprofen. And so we see words like that will almost guarantee if you see that word, it's going to be somebody who's likely to have a suicide attempt over the course of the conversation that we need to intervene in. Other ones were things like the crying face emoticon. So an emoticon, which I never expected would be actually indicative of any kind of risk, 11 times likely to occur in a conversation that ends up being an act of rescue than one that does not end up being an act of rescue. Whereas the word suicide, so something you would expect to be associated with suicidal risk, is actually equally likely to occur in a non-active rescue and an active rescue conversation. So not predictive at all of whether a conversation is actually high risk.
Wow.
There's some really unintuitive findings, but now we have this algorithm. We're going to put it in place in the next month or so and improve our triage system. Even the current version and the one we're iterating on, during that election spike when we saw 8 times the volume, we were able to answer our high-risk texters in an average of 39 seconds. So it leads to really practical applications in terms of helping our highest risk texters. I think that's one example. There are many more examples of looking at quality in conversations, feedback loops into the 36-hour online training that we have, that we hope insights from the research process and working with researchers can feed it back into direct impact on the quality of our service.
Well, that's an amazing kind of finding. The application of machine learning in this space is so interesting. But I think it's also, and one of the things you said is that these impacts are sort of at the whole range, going from sort of that direct impact into your service all the way up to understandings of public health in general, and sort of how do we improve that and bring that benefit back in a more general way as well.
Yeah.
And so
we have very small staff. Relatively, I don't actually have any direct background in mental health or expertise in that. And so I think we're in this neat position of saying we have this powerful data set. We don't know all the questions that should be asked. Even if we did, we don't have the bandwidth to handle them or the expertise to know how to ask the right questions. And so we just want to be the ones to share this data with the experts who have this knowledge, but lack the data to ask some of their hypotheses.
Yeah, and those experts might even be in a position to do the most with the findings. So one of our teams is from Colorado Hospital, and they really want to look at what type of language do children who have experienced abuse use other than the word abuse. So it's a great opportunity in our data set to start looking at language, and then they might, at the back end, start thinking, we've identified these terms, how do we tell clinicians this is what you should look for in a hospital system? We also have a project from the University of Montana Social Work Department, and they're really interested in using our data, specifically utilization rates across the geography of Montana, to decide how they might allocate mental health resources and monitor that over time. So I think there's definitely a lot of practical ways in which research questions can turn into policy change or improvements for mental health more generally.
Yeah, I think this is really an exciting data set that you've got, an exciting project and an exciting data set that's coming along with it. So we're about ready to wrap up, but I was just going to ask, is there, anything else you wanted to share or other thoughts that you have about that you want to let people know about?
Check out crisistrends.org. We're coming out with a new version before the end of the year. Really excited about that, and I think that's just going to highlight more of the interesting data we have in our system. And we're just excited about the wide range of possible questions that can be asked of this data. And so really excited to have more research teams and wide variety of research teams tap into understanding crisis and mental health in our country.
Yep, and our next application deadline for the office data is Jan 1.
That's excellent. So thank you very much. Again, Bob and Nitya, this has been great talking with you. And we'll post this along with some links that will both to your site and to crisistrends.org. And thanks very much. This has been excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep.